Hello and welcome. Thank you for being here and joining us. Today, we are going to be discussing the topic of tech before real estate. Now, that's a short and pithy way of saying it, but what we're really going to be looking at is whether tech should come before real estate when it comes to creating, designing, and establishing modern spaces of work. There's been a lot of disruption over the past 2 years, and we will be looking at whether or not the build process is ripe for disruption as well. I am joined today by Chris from ESCO, Matt from Space Connect, Jonathan from Asia Colliers International, and Jacob from Zoom. Guys, thank you so much for being here. We're going to start off with a really simple question, which is, should tech come before real estate? Now, to kind of set the scene, real estate is the most inelastic of all components of a build project, right? You're limited by what's available on the market, whether you want to purchase or you want to lease. And for the longest time, it's just made sense to focus on this inelastic component first, get it sorted, and then have everything else fall into place. So why should we change that now? Matt, where do you stand on the debate on where tech and where real estate should be in the build process?
Hi, H, thanks very much. I don't actually see how in today's world tech can't come before real estate. And I'm pretty much on the border with this, I'm on the fence. But it's really interesting because I was reading an article the other day, and it was a little bit of a dated article. It was back from December 2020. It was one of the Forbes articles, and they were talking about the effect of property tech on corporate real estate, and they were talking about it as seeing tech as a risk to CRE as a stable industry, and for businesses to plan in order to mitigate that risk. And it was quite interesting because I now see tech as an enabler into corporate real estate. And the reason I see that is, look, space is expensive, you know, wherever you are. I mean, I was looking at it a couple of days ago, and I think, you know, depending on where you are in Singapore, you could be anywhere from 108 to 170 US dollars per square foot. And if you're looking at an average of, say, 55, 60 square foot per person, that's a lot of space. But it's, and that assumption now, that one person needs one desk, I just don't believe holds true anymore. And the assumption that if you invite 10 people to a meeting, that all 10 are going to be in that meeting room, it just isn't true anymore. So that's why I see it as an enabler.
Jacob, Matt just said that tech is an enabler, and we've seen that, right? You're from Zoom, and VC platforms have literally changed how we work, and they've created these new hybrid versions and the digital workplace, and all these changes have happened. Do you believe that because of the enabler role that tech plays, that it should now be earlier and earlier in the build process, earlier and earlier in discussions around what the workplace is going to look like?
Absolutely. So if we look at how we define whether tech comes before real estate, is choosing what fits your business and what makes your team succeed. Over the last 2 years, we've learned a few things, right? People have learned to adapt to working from home or working from anywhere or even working remotely. Real estate has one fundamental flaw, which is capacity, right? And it's how we redefine that capacity. So a government can come and say, listen, you only can have 5 people in a specific room, or tomorrow it's going to be 10 people. You have to adapt as fast as you can. In different scenarios, we have experienced different outcomes. So I'll give you a few examples. When the pandemic was going on, the courtrooms had to go hybrid, right? And it's because cases were delayed because either the person was having COVID or it was too dangerous for that situation where we would infect other people. So we've seen a huge adoption of how courtrooms have gone hybrid. That's a useful way of expediting cases. The other aspects we've seen in terms of how we redefine the workforce is at Zoom, we even piloted certain areas like Amsterdam, Sydney, Denver, and London to have hybrid workspaces for our team to come in, right? It's not a one size fits all. We still need real estate to play a huge part. And we've seen multiple versions of that. I mean, if you look at Uber or Grab, Grab being the ESCO's own customer, I mean, they've put 200 over rooms just in Singapore for their drivers to access training, huddle rooms, things like that. So I think you've got to redefine the hybrid workspace to what the business fits for you, right?
Chris, like Jacob just mentioned, you're in the business of providing tech to these workspaces so they can function. And you haven't just been doing it for the past 2 years, right? You've been doing it for a long, long time at ESCO. What do you think has changed over the last 2 years of the pandemic, where you've seen this acceleration of tech adoption that you now believe, hey, you've got to start talking about tech much earlier in the build process?
Thanks, H. So, I mean, ESCO primarily operate in the enterprise AV and video conferencing space as a regional system integrator. And we've seen some steps in the right direction in terms of the perspective of technology and the role it plays. But, still, a lot of the time when you go down for a meeting and to propose an AV or UC solution, there's generally already a floor plan. And the space allocations have already been drawn out. And we talk to the client and they say, guys, look, so now what kind of solution are we going to put in each room, right? And on the face of it, I think that sounds okay, right? But the technology we're going to recommend is already going to be limited by certain factors, right? Such as, room dimensions, eventual furniture placement, and other like design related issues. So sometimes doing it this way is not really a coherent workplace strategy per se. I mean, you're investing in technology which allows hybrid working, but it may not always be utilized properly, right? Even if you look out on the office landscape, you may still be only 30% occupied at any given point on the day, and your rooms may only be 20% occupied, right? And in a way, it doesn't really sit well with us, to see the results like that. So if you're looking at technology first, I think we are really looking at understanding its capabilities, its usabilities, and organizations need to plot an adoption plan for the workforce and educate them on how simple it is to use so that they're able to scale it, right? So, I mean, like Jacob has mentioned, we do a lot of different kinds of spaces within, these environments. So we do acknowledge the different kinds of rooms have different kinds of needs. But nowadays, these spaces are fairly multifaceted, right? They don't only do one thing, right? Like they used to, right? In the past, you had a projector and a screen, and then this is a presentation room, and then you had a collab board and whatever, and this is a collaboration room. Now these rooms can do 3 or 4 things, right? I think if you look at the traditional, if you look at a Zoom rooms, for instance, Zoom rooms can be utilized over 3 or 4 different use cases, right? So it's more complex now. Yeah. So if you put this, yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So if you put all of these technologies together with other things like space optimization platforms like what Matt does, and plan a little bit into the future, you might be surprised with the actual real estate space that you require as an organization. The results might surprise you.
Jonathan, as director for flexible workplace consulting, right? What are you advising your clients to do, right? Like, when are you telling them, hey, now is the time to start thinking about tech, and now is the time to start thinking about real estate? Have you seen a shift in when these conversations are happening, or are you advocating for a shift for when these conversations are happening now?
Well, first of all, it's quite intimidating going last after we've had some quite 3 really good answers and a really good question, and so I've got to kind of follow that, which is I'm struggling to come up with something new that hasn't already been said. But I have probably a fairly unique perspective on this, because in my role I'm working with building owners landlords, working with investors into real estate and into operators that go into there. And then I'm working with sort of flexible workspace operators or co-working operators, but also other building amenity operators like hospitality operators, F&B, fitness and wellness, all that kind of thing. And then also working with our occupier clients to look at strategies. So I think fundamentally, I think hybrid's probably the word that's going to get, probably most used during the next hour of this conversation. I think the physical space, the quality of the building, the amenities that are available in that building, I think all of those things have always been important, but I think we'll definitely see a flight to quality in terms of people wanting to be located in a very good quality building that's been built well. It's been built to sort of various sort of wellness standards. There's various sort of measurements of that around the world, depending on which market you're in. And the sort of where that building is located. So, the old sort of saying about real estate of location, location, location is probably still the case, but maybe slightly softer than it had been historically. So I feel like the physical location of the real estate, the quality of that real estate, and the amenities that come with it are as important, if not more important than ever. But I am probably similar to Matt, where I'm sort of very close to the middle on this, because I think technology has to be acknowledged and has to be the technology solution that's appropriate is wrapped around that physical solution and forms part of the decision making around that physical solution. So, maybe coming at it from a slightly different angle to the guys, but it's quite common now where you might have a bunch of people working from home. You might have people working from an alternative space, which might be a local flexible workspace or co-working center nearby, or a library or a private members club or a friend's house or a coffee shop. And then you've got kind of people in the office, to enable that to be supported, from what Jacob said earlier, you've got to be able to wrap a technology solution around that. And connectivity is, pretty important. And I would probably say there's probably not one tech solution. There's probably a number of tech solutions that need to be, strung together. But, what physically is going into those spaces within the office that you control, in terms of sort of enabling a sort of multi-user spaces, whether it's and then also sort of apps to control the use of that space, etc. But then what is being put together to help enable the stuff that you're not necessarily in control of? Because if it's someone working from home in the countryside that maybe doesn't have great Wi-Fi, how are you solving for that? How are you solving for someone that's in a coffee shop and all the security issues that might come with public Wi-Fi and things like that? So you got all these elements of issues, but so I think that the technology piece is definitely also more important than ever, and that kind of needs to be supporting the real estate decision and a factor of it, but not the factor. I think it's one of a number of factors.
There was something very interesting you mentioned, Jonathan, and you brought it up, and that's the remote location, right? I started this entire discussion off by saying, hey, corporate real estate is inelastic, right? You get what you get, and that's it. And scaling up and scaling down is much harder. But like you mentioned, the office is not the office anymore. You've got the remote location there as well. And that kind of makes it more elastic. It makes it more flexible, right? Like if half your workforce is working from home, all of a sudden your office space has increased manifolds. If 25, then it's shrunk. If it goes to 75, it's gone back up, right? And there's this new flexible element to corporate real estate. And like you mentioned, it needs to be supported, right? And Chris, I'd like to get your thoughts. Do you believe technology is the only way we bridge office and remote location?
Yeah, I think so, right? I think the importance of having a true hybrid strategy cannot be downplayed. I mean, if you in today's world, when you hire people, I think within the first three questions, besides pay and job scope, the third is, what kind of working arrangements is it going to be like, right? So you definitely have to cater for it, right? So as an organization, I would say, if you have a certain plan, let's say 70-30 or 60-40, right? You need the technological enablers, right? And in order to do so, you need to understand what the technology can do, right? So that's the first step, right? So again, having the real estate first, is maybe having things the other way around.
Matt, you help people build that bridge, right? Are they being receptive to this idea of, hey, if you want to bridge these two, right? You want to bridge your workspace and the remote location, you've got to start thinking tech earlier and earlier.
Yeah, technology helps, and helps to a very, very large degree. But what we're also seeing is that internal processes within companies are changing as well. Companies are adapting to accommodate the fact that, hey, people need to work from home, but also need to come into the office. And if there's specific activities that they can do quite happily at home where there isn't a need to be connected to the office, then so be it. And what we're seeing is the trend of these Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday work days coming through, where members of their staff are coming in on those particular days, and they're coming for various reasons, but predominantly to collaborate with their employees and collaborate with with their colleagues. So yeah, I see it as one way, but I also see the adaptation of businesses to new ways of working being another way of that.
And Jacob, just to sum the conversation up, right? Are people coming to you earlier? Are they coming over to you and going like, hey, Zoom is so important, VC is so important for us to be able to manage this new hybrid digital workplace, and to make it happen, we need you here from the start, or relatively from the start? Is that a conversation that you're experiencing?
Absolutely, all the time. I think if you see what the pandemic has taught Zoom is we had to innovate very, very quickly, right? We were poised with a lot of great challenges. For example, in the retail space, where when there was lockdowns and limitations and people needed access to sell their stuff, you've seen the rise of all online retail stuff. Now, we were able to give them a hybrid scenario where they can actually use social distancing to bring the people they need to do that. But we've also learned from the capacity restrictions of the retail aspect. And what I mean by that is, if I'm selling, say, Korean beauty products, and I'm only a Korean speaker, what Zoom has done is we've introduced live translation and live transcription. So anyone in the world breaks that barrier in terms of now I have accessibility beyond that real estate space, right? So it's a multiple environment. In terms of flipping rooms, if you have a real estate space, if you take hotels, for example, how many hotels have converted to COVID response centers, vaccination centers? What we've done in that aspect is the digital signage, where we were able to use that signage, whether it's for a specific purpose. The real estate remains elastic, we're still there, but we are utilizing that space to its maximum. So we've got a lot of great examples, and the pandemic's really helped us innovate much quicker. We've also helped in terms of virtual kiosks and virtual receptionists. So those are the aspects where you can come to a kiosk and get services, whether it's banking, retail, any kind of service that you need help desk requirements for. So we find the ability to give an individual to have access to Zoom from their phone to any device, like you can walk into any work environment or workspace and just in the click of a button, shift it to a huddle room, a meeting room, and have that flexibility. You're no longer restricted by the hardware in that space, how old it is. You have that flexibility to move around. So we see this as a big advantage, especially with co-working spaces and transforming rooms very quickly.
Thank you. We're creatures of habit, right? You've all made a really good case for having that tech conversation earlier and earlier in the build process. But as I'm looking at it from client side, I've done things a particular way for such a long time. This is what I was taught. This is what I've been doing for, let's say, the majority of my career. And now I'm having to adapt, right? I'm going to have to change my workflows. I'm going to have to change my mindset. Jonathan, are you seeing that change in mindset? Are there things that I can do from a client side, right? From someone who's trying to build a workplace? What can I do to be more cognizant of technology and more in touch with what workers today are demanding from workspaces?
Yeah, look, I think we're on a look, real estate moves quite slowly, right? And at Colliers, most of the occupier clients that we deal with are larger corporates. So they're kind of hamstrung to the extent that they can't really change their real estate strategy. That, they can't massively pivot until they kind of have a lease event, i.e. they have like a potential lease expiry or an ability to drop some space or things like that. So, I think we're kind of seeing the tip of the iceberg at the moment, because the people that do have those lease events are reassessing what their strategy is. Not necessarily dropping space, but definitely using it differently. But there will be more of that to come as people have leases. What I'm seeing definitely from a landlord side is landlords are definitely aware of this and definite changes, and are trying to solve for that. It's not always easy. Again, you might not have the space available, but some of the landlord clients I'm working with, where we're looking at how to make that building, how to essentially make that building better by potentially providing sort of shared amenities, shared meeting rooms, some kind of lounge space, better F&B, better wellness facilities, things like that. But all, technology has an impact on those in terms of accessing those spaces and things like that. But there are a couple of things that are out there at the moment which we think are probably a trend going forward, which falls into the tech bucket, which is looking at spaces on demand. And there are various platforms out there, Dasana and Upflex probably being two of the ones that allow you to sort of occupiers to book space on demand. And we're seeing those sort of form part of people's solutions, and the larger flex operators like IWG and WeWork sort of offering those at scale as well. So it does fall into it. What I would say, and what's definitely been highlighted, is the different. I heard someone say earlier when we were doing the warm up was about when the pandemic was happening. In Hong Kong, it's still very much happening. I'm based in Hong Kong, so we're definitely not through that. And I think one of the things that's definitely clear is probably 2 years ago or 3 years ago, most corporate occupiers were creating a real estate strategy and getting sort of rolled out globally, and things were becoming very samey. I think what we've got now is that everything is very market specific. So the real estate solution in Hong Kong might look very different to the real estate solution even in Singapore, or even in China, or even in Japan or Australia, because each market is different. In Hong Kong, we've got a very unique situation here where people have very small living accommodation, so work from home doesn't really work. So there you've got to find, but Wi-Fi connectivity is really good. So there you've got really good Wi-Fi connectivity. But I'm lucky. I live on my own in a reasonable sized apartment. But you might have other people that have a similar sized apartment where there might be 2 or 3 people living in it. So therefore, it's not possible to work from home. It's not possible necessarily to get them to the office. So then you've got to find other solutions. So whereas versus Australia, where living accommodation is generally a lot more generous, you've got a lot more people then therefore much more willing to work from home. So that means that the technology solution applied alongside the real estate, varies from market to market, and is definitely making, I guess, a corporate real estate head for an occupier even more challenging.
Matt, Johnson pointed out a really interesting friction point, which is corporate real estate moves slow, right?
Yeah.
It takes time. You need to wait out your lease. You need to find something new, and you need to basically just be slow. Hybrid work is being demanded right now, right? People need that flexibility right now.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on how we eliminate this point of friction? I know Jonathan pointed out that, hey, these on-demand places are cropping up. WeWork has had a really good 2 years, but from your end, do you see any other solutions?
Yeah. So I think that was actually quite a poignant piece there. And I jotted it down just so that I could remember it, because the sorts of clients that we interact with are corporate occupiers, and one of the biggest one of the biggest areas, or the biggest concerns for them, during the pandemic, and yes, we're still in it, and we see this trend across the world, is that of flexibility. And because corporate real estate moves slowly, it's how do they introduce that flexibility? And there's two areas of flexibility that they're after. One is in terms of cost, and two is in terms of term. And you just can't exit a 5-year lease, or unless you've got break clauses built in, or whatever the case is. And so clients were coming to us to say, look, we're paying you all this money for a service that, through no fault of our own, we can't enjoy because the government has told us we can't go into our office. So what do we do? And as a business who's trying to be profitable, you have one frame of mind, but also as a business who understands what's going on in the world and what's important for your clients, you have another frame of mind. So flexibility is absolutely key in terms of that term, and that's why somebody mentioned the point about scalability earlier, and that's why we adopted very early to have a flexible approach in order towards term, so that allows our clients to actually either scale up or scale down the use of their services, depending on what government advice is like, or staff demand to return to the office or go back into the office as well. The other point, the other side of things, or just following on from that, is if you're going to be putting in a solution and thinking about how you put that tech in, is I think Jacob made the point earlier about responding to the needs of the business, and you have to engage with your employees to find out what tech they're using and what tech makes their life easier, in their personal life, but also what they could possibly use and hold in a working environment. And then there's also an immense amount of information out there, hopefully, from companies' own FM departments, or just go and research it as to what historical trends were in terms of usage. So look at what my average occupancy was, on any particular day or over a specific period of time. Look at what my meeting room usage was like. Chris mentioned the point about things being 20% occupied, and that's a big bugbear for a tremendous amount of clients. But then the other thing is that you need to actually look at what best of breed and fit for purpose solutions are out there in order to get you that accurate information, pretty much. And what you're looking at there is you're trying to marry up this whole user experience from a consumer side of things and trying to bring that into a commercial side of things. And that's not always easy, because from what we've seen, and we've seen this not only from the software side of things, but also from the hardware side of things, is that commercial solutions tend to be about 3 or 4 versions behind consumer versions. So I think that's some of the strategies that you can try to use to bridge that.
Chris, kind of coming back on topic, from your perspective, what does a world where tech comes before real estate look like, other than the fact that you get engaged at an earlier date and have more time and don't have that time pressure and short window to complete your works?
Well, just taking into account the points raised by Jonathan and Matt as well, right? So we mentioned that real estate is pretty slow moving, right? But we are kind of 2 years into COVID, and like what Jonathan has pointed out, there are companies where they're kind of in between leases, right? So we see it as a little bit of a unique timing opportunity which normally wouldn't exist, right? Because people are thinking, okay, so now I have options. I need to consider what kind of investment should I make, right? So generally, over the last 1.5 years, we've seen a definite reduction in terms of real estate, right, in the corporate sector, right? By how much, I don't have the figures offhand, but we know it's getting slightly smaller. But on the other hand, the technology is far more well thought out, right? They're not wasting the space for sure, right? Then thinking about what kind of technology is going into it, and the investments are definitely more well measured, right? In terms of the hardware, we are looking at far more non-proprietary hardware, more flexible, more interoperability, so that people can use different platforms in the work environment to suit multiple different use cases. So broadly speaking, how I see the tech and real estate in the future, right? The shift is very gradual. It's not going to be suddenly tech. Everyone's looking at tech first and deciding what the entire workplace strategy should be. But we see organizations that already have positions in terms of digital transformation, in terms of workplace strategy. I think a lot of these companies, they will continue to put more thought and more effort into this, right? And once you have more thought leadership in these areas, companies will naturally pivot and gravitate towards thinking about the use cases of these technologies, right? Which will benefit probably all of us. Yep.
Jacob, Chris just pointed out something very, very interesting, which was, hey, if you were lucky and your lease was, up at exactly the time COVID hit, and you didn't sign the new lease and you went to a flexible model and you waited out 2 years, you saved a lot of money on not having an office space that you couldn't use. But if you were stuck in your lease, then you just had to go through and ride the pandemic out. Do you think that we're still in a transitionary period, right? Like we had the disruption by COVID, the pandemic years. Now we're coming out of it, fingers crossed, across the globe. I know Hong Kong's not as lucky, but restrictions and regulations are being eased slightly. Do you think that on the client side, they're just like, maybe if I ride it out another year or two, we can find out where the equilibrium is, where the dust settles? Or do you think the time to act is now?
I think the time to act is based on the business need, right? So if you look at a startup today, the growth that they've had in the last 2 years may have exceeded the capacity that they had. And there's a lot of customers that we've seen where they've had phenomenal growth or phenomenal contraction, right? And there's also a lot of implications what the pandemic has taught us, which is, if you're in small spaces, your mental health is of a concern. And there was this whole aspect of the Great Resignation. All these play in terms of how an employer now needs to see how they provide their employees a good hybrid workplace, right? So the things that will not change is education. We're not going to tell our kids, hey, go back to school. I mean, there will always be an option for hybrid learning because we can't disrupt education, right? We can't disrupt healthcare, right? We need to be able to do potentially a COVID test or ART test remotely. So I think technology will have to be based on what the business need requires and how they transform that specific room in real estate. Real estate still plays a huge importance. I mean, you can't dine virtually, right? You still have to dine in a restaurant, but it's all about what the corporate occupiers are talking about in terms of how do I scale? How do I remain flexible? How can I reuse that space in that time period that I have left, right? Can I convert it to maybe an experience center? Maybe I don't have that many employees and I have a shared office experience. There's a lot of things that people are coming up creatively, and we're working with partners like ESCO to look at some of those aspects, look at some of those requirements. So the design phase of business requirement will determine how the tech will be implemented there, right? And we've seen multiple examples of that.
Jonathan, before we move off this topic, I'd like to get your thoughts as well. Are you seeing people who are leasing or purchasing property for enterprise? Are they taking a proactive approach, or are they just like, hey, I'll wait 6 months more and see what happens? I'll wait 6 months more and see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a fair bit of kicking the can down the road. What we've seen definitely in the sort of flexible workspace sector, or co-working, if that's the term you prefer to use, we've definitely seen in Asia anyway, and I think this has been repeated elsewhere, is the demand for flexible workspace from occupiers has definitely gone up. The pricing of that space has probably gone slightly down, but the demand for it has definitely gone up. And the size of that demand seems to just be increasing month by month. I think what that data is telling us, if demand is now, kind of people looking for 20, 30, 50, 100 people in a sort of on a sort of 12-month contract in some sort of flex space per se. What that data is telling us is, well, one, it's telling us the demand for that type of flex space is up, but what's it really telling us? And I'm not so sure, because I think I'm in two minds. I think it's probably partly telling us that yes, people want flexibility because there's uncertainty. I'm not entirely sold that it's going to be a long-term thing. It feels to me that it might be partly long-term strategy for some occupiers, but it might also be partly kicking the can down the road, because you might have an office that's coming up to expiry and my options are to lease that for another 3 years or another 5 years, or to move out and move part of it out or all of it out into some flexible workspace for 12 months, because I've got that option if I do that, and then I can kind of I can kind of figure it out down the road. I think it's a little bit of both. But if we imagine that, even if it's 50-50, that means that there's still going to be a greater demand for long-term, sort of more flexible space. So I guess the bigger question then is how the landlords adapt to that. And then what I would say is probably landlords, it's just an impossibility that you can ever have people that just access the space they need when they need it and exactly how much they need. Like, real estate just doesn't work like that. But I think we can get closer to that, and technology will definitely play a big part in that, in terms of booking access to space, and sort of aligning with landlords, because kind of what you've got at the moment, in the most part, is you might have a deal for your traditional office with your landlord, and then you kind of got to go get in the lift and go down a few floors and go and do a second deal with the flex operator in the building. What I think you'll probably see going forward is you'll see more of that kind of come together in how it's offered to the market as a product. I think as a sweeping statement, it's still, by landlords, not all landlords, but by some landlords, it's still considered two separate things. And until we sort of bridge that gap between operators partnering with landlords or landlords delivering that kind of space themselves, we'll never kind of get away from that. But I think if there's some kind of partnership approach, there are other elements of your real estate that you can definitely outsource on a kind of as you need it basis. It might be access to co-working spaces. It might be access to some kind of shared lounge. It might be access to meeting spaces. So that will enable some occupiers to start reducing their long-term liability. Because if you imagine a building that has a floor of, a suite of meeting spaces somewhere in the building, that means you don't need to carry those meeting spaces on your books for the duration of your lease. You might be able to reduce the number of meeting rooms you deliver for yourself. So, but then that's got to be up to scratch technology-wise. So, look, technology is everywhere you turn, so you've got to acknowledge it and you've got to make sure it's part of the solution. But, what I'm sort of saying here is it will definitely, I liked Matt's point earlier about it being an enabler, because I don't particularly like the phrase of sort of prop tech being a disruptor and things like that, because I don't think prop tech is disrupting real estate. I think it's enabling us to deliver a better product. by using it as an enabler and kind of embracing technology rather than it being one or the other.
Yeah. Really nice summation. We've kind of understood what needs to happen on client side with regards to having better strategies for scaling up, scaling down, integration of fixed and flexible working spaces, and how prop tech needs to kind of be not a disruptor but an enabler. Chris, I'd like to switch the focus back onto us. What do you think ESCO needs to do, or what kind of mindset changes or operational changes or functional changes or just changes in general that you think ESCO will be implementing as technology moves up and up and up in the conversation of build projects?
I think our approach has always really been the same, right? I think in terms of the technology, there are always a few key priorities. I think the first priority is we need to establish a good use case for the customer, right? Once that is done, then it comes to the hardware. We always want things with good quality. Then it needs to be, of course, future proof, right? Ideally, it needs to support at least 2 or more platforms. It needs to be a scalable technology. And of course, it needs to be remote monitoring capable, right? So, I mean, we talk about, like a platform like Zoom, for instance, right? You have dashboards, you're able to monitor usage, you're able to see which rooms up or down, right? So you can do it on a software back side. So if you can't do it on the hardware back side, then you're only really solving half the problem, right? So when you talk about enterprise grade level scalability, you have to go all the way. You can't just go halfway. Yeah. So for us, those are key priorities.
Jacob, you already said that people are coming to you earlier and earlier to discuss their requirements and needs. And you also elaborated on how Zoom is, taking the opportunity of early engagement to really understand customers, figure out what features they want, and then just providing value. What's next? We all know that VC is very important. What's next on the roadmap for you guys to just improve user outcomes when they're using Zoom?
So a few things that we are embarking on is helping people build that hybrid workspace, and starts off with what is the customer experience that they want to achieve for themselves and for their own customers. So we have, to Chris's point, we have seen multiple use cases. We've seen, as I mentioned, courtrooms have gone hybrid, healthcare has gone hybrid. So there will be more and more use cases that we see where you show up at a new ticketing kiosk or a ATM where there will be aspects of digital communication. So we have a plethora of scalable products, whether you're doing in all hands or reacting to a national emergency in your country, right? We are able to scale from a huddle room to people or doing a countrywide communication, right? So having that flexibility on a single platform gives the customers a lot of benefits. We've done that for WHO, we've done that for multiple governments recently. And that's the aspect that when Chris says having the right technology that's scalable, it's not only looking at the confines of your real estate, but how can you broaden communication anytime and anywhere.
Jonathan, you kind of elaborated on some of the challenges that you're facing. Things like people want flexible and fixed real estate, but they have to go to 2 different operators because the landlord doesn't have a package. Prop tech is taking more and more importance and needs to be fit into all of their plans. So how are you juggling with all these challenges that are so nebulous and not really defined, because we're still searching for clarity? So in your job function, what are you doing?
Yeah, I think, look, my role in all of this is, as I said earlier, I've got a unique perspective because I'm working with, the kind of 3 stakeholders, really. The operators that might be running whatever hospitality or co-working or flex space might be in the building, and working with landlords as well to understand what that should be and where that should go, and then working with the occupiers who end up using it. So probably a fairly grounded experience. I think we all need to remember that I think landlords get bashed a little bit in the press around kind of their views on real estate and some of the challenges and whatever. But there are some realities around essentially structuring deals, whether that's how they finance the building or how the deal looks between them and the operator that has certain parts of the building. So my role really is to work with the landlords and the operators to ensure that the deal that they have between literally down to the sort of commercial deal that they have with each other enables them to offer what the market needs, in the most appropriate way. Because I think historically we've always kind of had flexible workspace, co-working operators, or any kind of amenity in the building kind of on a traditional lease between landlord and operator. And now I think we're seeing more kind of management type agreements or partnership type agreements or landlords delivering things themselves. And those three things, to varying degrees allow a certain amount of removal of that friction. But you're never going to get to a point where people can kind of fluidly use space, because real estate just doesn't work like that. But you definitely could do better. So I think my role really is to make sure that those deals are structured in the right way to enable or to remove as much friction for the end user as possible. Because I think one of the things I always say is that as a landlord, the landlord doesn't make the market. As an operator, the operator doesn't make the market. As a somebody who's kind of putting these deals together, I don't make the market, and the person that's building the spaces don't make the market either. What makes the market is the end user, and that end user is the occupier. But more importantly, and again, I think we've accelerated these trends more recently, is maybe it's not even the occupier that makes the market, it's the people that work for them that makes the market, because people are voting with their feet. So really it's the end user, and the attention needs to be on what does the end user want. The occupier might want one thing, but their actual employees and their teams might want something very different. So it's understanding not just what the occupier wants, but what that end user wants, and then kind of working back from that to figure out how to deliver it in the most efficient and frictionless way. And I guess my small role in that is to ensure that we understand what that is, first and foremost, and then we structure deals that enable the least amount of friction possible. And then we sort of go from there. This is where you guys sort of step in with the technology solutions and sort of building these spaces out.
Matt, I'd like you to take us home. Johnson just said it's the end user that builds the market, right? And we're seeing that play out right now, right? We referenced the Great Resignation. People don't want to work, and there are multiple reasons for that. But one of the reasons is, if you're not offering me the flexibility, I'm not going to come into work, right? We just saw Goldman Sachs try to bring their entire workforce back. They sent out a little email, and 50% of the people decided we're just going to stay home, right? So people are figuring out what they want right now as time progresses. How do we navigate this kind of like transformational period where people are figuring out what they want, and then people are figuring out how to deliver what the other people want? What do we do?
No, it's actually a really good point, and I hark back to what I said earlier about engaging with your people to find out, what is it that you want in your environment. I think way gone are the days where employers can say, look, this is your office space, there's your desk, sit down there, come into work and do that. It's really interesting because there was an article by Indeed not too long ago about what is, just on this, what is it that people would want when they want to come into the office? And they said that something like 73% of employees miss the actual socializing with their colleagues in person. 45% of those miss those in-person meetings, but it was not about the spontaneous innovation that you get from people. It was just purely about human interaction. So it's like stripping it away and just bringing us back down to what, the fact that we're people and that we're, group organisms. I think that when it comes to finding out what people want, is just open up and just ask them, what is it that you want to see in your environment? What is it that wasn't working for you before? And what is it that we need to do that's going to enable you to be the best possible productive version of yourself within the office environment that you can be? And, we're in a technological world these days, so it's not only the four walls around us, it's how do you interact with that? And where tech plays a part in that is you have to look at the sort of type of tech that you're going to have in your office environment. So, you're going to have the type of tech that people interact with, and, that needs to have a super simple UX. It could be incredibly engaging, incredibly immersive. We're seeing some amazing products come out in the marketplace like that as well. But there's also, excuse me, from the employee perspective, the sort of tech that people don't see yet interact with that enables them to have that whole environment. So where, excuse me, what I'm talking about is things like sensors such as air quality sensors, just to make sure that there's got the right levels of oxygen in the office. I know ESCO does some stuff around that. I'm talking about things like light sensors to measure the right amount of light, that people don't start feeling droopy or sleepy, and that they're feeling motivated and confident. Having the ability to have sort of configurable spaces to allow for mixed use environments. So if somebody wants to concentrate on a particular activity, and this goes down to activity-based environments, there's an area that they can go to for that. Or if they just need to drop down for a couple of hours and do something else in another area, then they can go to that. I don't think it's a one size fits all, but it does come back to having, that point I made about an incredible amount of flexibility, but also I think just being able to see what's out there, to reconfigure spaces to adapt to what your staff are asking you for.
Excellent. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. The conversation has been really engaging, so much so that there are a bunch of questions. We are very close to ending, but please send your questions in. And what I'm going to be doing is, because everyone here is from such a diverse and different, job function, I'm just going to throw these questions to whoever I think is best suited to answer them. If you want to chime in, please do so. The Q&A is going to be a bit freeform. Jonathan, we're going to start with you. There's a question on elaborating between what an occupier and an operator is. And following to that is, if there's a flexible space operator in the building, are they not also the same as being an occupier? So perhaps you could elaborate a bit more on the jargon.
Yeah, sure. I mean, second part of that question is quite an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, quite simply, an occupier is the end user of the space, or the company that the end user of the space belongs to. So, could be, Zoom could be the renting an office in an office building. Colliers could be renting an office in an office building. That would be the occupier, and then they obviously have the teams that work for them. Essentially, is the end user. So the end user is the individual. The occupier is the company, basically, is taking space. The operator that I'm referring to could be a co-working space. It could be a flexible workspace, depending on terminology you use. Could be a private members club or a hospitality operator that sort of runs or operates the various kind of functions in the building that people can use. The second part of the question is a very good one, and I'll try and keep it as short as I can, so I'm running out of time. But basically, quite often we see, and traditionally we've seen, and we still see it now, annoyingly, is that basically the landlords tend to do a very traditional looking lease, as they would do with any other tenant in the building, to the operator. So if you think about a flexible workspace or some kind of hospitality space in an office building, if that deal between which I was referring to earlier, to try and remove that friction, if that deal is an arm's length lease between the operator and the landlord, then that operator is not incentivized in the right way to operate that space as an amenity to the building. They have to keep that space full to be able to pay their rent and then make a sort of profit. Where I've been advocating for a long time is at the very least some form of partnership, which may result in a lower than market rent, some kind of capital contribution from the landlord, and then therefore align the interests. Ideally, it would be management agreement where there was no rent and the landlord was putting in the capex, and then therefore it would be aligned even further. Because if you think about it, if that space is there to provide an amenity to the building, it's impossible to be an amenity to the building if you're on a lease. So yes, normally they are no different to a regular occupier of the building because typically they're on a lease. But in an ideal world, there's not really much point. The value for a landlord of having a flexible workspace operator in the building, but on a lease, means there's very little value at all. They're just another occupier. If it's more of a partnership or a management agreement, then therefore it could be an amenity to the building.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jacob, there's a question which I think is perfect for you. Do you think that tech is now in a position, it has matured to a point where it can lead the conversation in a build project?
Absolutely. I've also answered it on the chat, but what I see is the platform has to be scalable, whether it's 2 users or doing a live concert or live webinar, we should be able to scale that. So it has to be very simple for the users, and the digital signage is able to transform that space for the operator of that real estate. So I think that flexibility gives a lot of options for someone to use their real estate and monetize it really quickly.
And our final question for our session today, I would like to throw that to Chris and Matt. The question is, do you feel that some parts of technology, such as IT and VC, maybe get discussed earlier and earlier in build projects, but parts such as AV and IT and endpoints remain where they are in the build project? So we've been discussing tech as broad stroke tech, right? They're kind of breaking it down. They're going, hey, Wi-Fi is really important. VC is very important. Let's start discussing this earlier. But maybe questions such as what display size to get and things like that. And let's leave that for down the road. Chris, what are your thoughts?
I think this question summarizes the pain of my entire career in AV. So, and it's also a yes or no question, so I could just say yes and move on. But I will attempt to answer it. So yes, I think to a certain extent, definitely. So AV and probably the VC portion does get left a little bit towards the end of the project, and it can be frustrating, right? Because it feels that we are a little bit of an afterthought, right? And we can't really get the right user experience we want because we are constrained by other factors. But it's not all doom and gloom. On the positive side of things, there's a lot of evolution in terms of positions of the people looking after these kinds of technology, right? So in the past, it could have been IT managers, sub portfolio, right, who's looking after many things, and AV just happened to fall on his lap, and he just was facilitating whatever it is, right? But the natural evolution of a company's hybrid strategy means that there are more meaningful roles such as workplace strategies, hybrid work strategies who get involved with these things at a much earlier level than what an IT manager would, right? So these decisions on what kind of endpoints to use, what kind of VC platforms to use, the discussion starts earlier, and it's very beneficial to us. So I would say it's positive.
Matt, just to kind of spin the question a little bit, how do we make sure that these two tech things don't get like divested and then one part moves up and the other part stays where it's at?
Honestly, I really don't know, because we're always the last to find out, and there isn't much more that I could add on to what Chris just said. It's I really wish that companies would would look at that much earlier on, rather than we need some sort of VC solution, we need some sort of panel outside the room, we need some sort of sensor or some sort of management system. It's a tough one, and I think the value of the relationships that we have in the industry really plays into that quite strongly. And I think it's also trying to feed back that demand. You know, usually you talk about building from the bottom up, but I think it's, you know, the point that Jonathan made earlier about, well, who creates the market? Well, it's the end users. They give you the demand, and it's having that demand flow all the way back down the chain rather than the other way, to say, look, this is what people are asking for. I mean, look, you know, Zoom's got competitors, we've got competitors, Esco's got competitors. It's, you know, that's just the way of the world, but there's always the differentiators that will make that difference. And it's the people right at the planning stage that need to understand those differentiators, and then build their solutions around what's best for that company based on those differentiators.
Jonathan, we're almost at the end, and Jacob, we're almost at the end, but I really want to get your thoughts on this as well. Jonathan, to me, this seems like a problem of a verbalized demand from the user versus non-verbalized demand. If there is no internet, right, if wireless dead spots exist, they're going to start screaming instantly and people are going to find out. But if the meeting room experience is not that good, they're just not going to use the meeting room, and they're not really going to complain about it, but it's not going to be used as much. The space isn't delivering ROI. Are you seeing this kind of dichotomy that's shown, where when people talk to you about tech, or when you talk to them about tech, they're like, yeah, we really need good wireless coverage. We need, like, the IT infrastructure needs to be there, internet needs to be like perfect, and then they just don't talk about the rest of the stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think most of the clients, occupier clients that I work with, are larger corporates, so they tend to either have in-house or outsourced, you know, workplace strategy guys involved. But I think, you know, that is only a portion of the market. You know, a lot of companies are, you know, small and medium-sized businesses or startups that maybe don't have those people. Look, you can't solve for everything. You know, you can basically, you know, do your best. And you know, yeah, look, if there's somebody there that can measure some of this stuff and utilization, again, maybe that's where tech can come in terms of, you know, it'd be a pretty obvious thing to look at if somebody bothered to look at it. You know, if you were using a co-working space, you'd be able to know how many times you were using that meeting room. And if you were never using it, then, you know, because you were booking it on an app, if you're never using it, then, you know, then you might start to ask questions of why you're not using it. If it's your own office and you're a bigger corporate, then maybe that's a little bit easier to measure. And, you know, again, you know, it's not easy if somebody's running a business to be continually asking their teams what they want. Best practice,
user feedback is hard.
Yeah,
getting user feedback is hard. They like the terminology and methodology behind that is intense.
Yeah, so you need to keep those things simple, and things like that. But, you know, you can track sort of usage of meeting room by, you know, booking systems and things like that, and maybe sensors if it's not too delicate a point to look at where the space is being used in the office and things like that. But, you know, you know, you need a whole team doing that, and so it depends how big your business is.
Jacob, final thoughts. VC, right? It's so much about experience, right? And the experience isn't just delivered by Zoom, right? If there is a meeting room, it's delivered by all the peripherals and all the technology and all the hardware that's in there. The question kind of says that, hey, you know, IT and VC might just move up. You guys might get engaged early, but then the other components, such as the hardware peripherals and the endpoints, they get relegated to kind of like later down the line. Are you advocating people to take a more holistic approach when they're looking at tech?
Absolutely. I think the point you made earlier was around, you know, the readiness of understanding whether you have the right wireless connectivity. I think the last 2 years we've seen the huge adoption of 5G in a lot of mature countries, and that's giving them scale. And that's required in qualification of that space, right? You won't go and do this in a remote location. Say, hey, tech's going to change that view if you don't have that capability there. So I think there needs to be validation. But to take the ability to take a meeting or video conferencing capability on an iOS or Android platform, that's going to be standardized. I mean, even if you're not limited by the peripherals, you still can always default back to your mobile phone, right? So I think that scalability of giving that seamless transition and having chat capability where you can archive it, it's HIPAA certified, is very, very important as companies look at compliance around how people communicate across the globe.
Thank you so much for your time. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, guys. Pleasure.
And audience, thank you so much for joining us. We will be back sometime soon with another conversation for you guys.